The U.S.-Canada trade war has now lasted a year. It began when Donald Trump applied 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, declared a national emergency at the border, and promised these measures would bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., reduce the trade deficit, stop fentanyl, and pressure Canada into negotiating on America's terms. Today, we can review the actual outcomes, not projections or partisan opinions, but real results. Job losses, factory closures, lost leverage, and economic damage on both sides of a border crossed by 400,000 people daily. The auto industry Trump vowed to protect is shrinking in both countries. Canada's oil leverage is disappearing as it builds Pacific export infrastructure that will outlast U.S. election cycles. The trade deficit remains, driven by energy imports American refineries cannot replace. Meanwhile, Canada has become a leading force in a coalition reshaping global trade without U.S. approval. According to insiders near the White House, senior advisors privately conclude the Canada strategy failed to meet any of its goals. To understand why, consider how cars are made in North America. Parts cross the U.S.-Canada border 7 to 8 times before final assembly. For example, a transmission is cast in Indiana, machined in Ontario, subassembled in Michigan, installed back in Ontario, then exported to the U.S. This is a single integrated manufacturing process spanning a border that's existed since 1867. Trump's 25% tariff applied at every crossing, effectively taxing the entire supply chain, including American plants. The results matched expert warnings, not promises. Stellantis shut its Windsor, Ontario plant and laid off 900 U.S. workers in Michigan and Indiana who made parts for Canadian assembled vehicles. Layoffs began before tariffs took effect because manufacturers plan in advance. Canadian auto parts jobs dropped 9.5% by December 2025, and Windsor-based John Engineering sales plummeted 70%, a business reliant on cross-border integration. GM wrote off $53 billion in EV strategy setbacks, cutting over 3,300 U.S. EV jobs. Their 2026 guidance includes $3 to $4 billion in tariff-related costs, a direct and significant expense affecting vehicle prices for U.S. consumers. Auto industry analyst Ross McKenzie points out the U.S.-Canada auto supply chain is already scrambled eggs, decades of integration that cannot simply be reversed. Since the 1965 Auto Pact, 61 years of cooperation produced better, cheaper cars by sharing tasks across borders. Trump's tariffs tried to undo this at a high cost to workers in Cuckoo and Windsor alike. When Trump began the trade war, he assumed Canada depended on the U.S. for oil more than the U.S. needed Canadian energy, since 60% of U.S. crude imports come from Canada with no alternative markets. After 1 year, this assumption fell apart as Canada developed new export routes. Canada plans to export 50 million tons of LNG annually to Asia by 2030. LNG Canada in British Columbia is operational and expanding. The government used national security powers to fast-track Pacific Coast pipeline projects stalled for years. Long-term supply contracts were signed with China, Japan, and South Korea. New infrastructure is redirecting Canadian energy away from U.S.-bound pipelines toward Asia, with partial capacity expected within months and full capacity in years. The Hormuz crisis further undermined U.S. leverage, making Canadian crude the U.S.'s most reliable large-scale energy source amid global disruptions. At the same time, Canada gained more export alternatives. Tariffs raised Canada's average U.S. tariff burden from 0.1% to 5.8%, intended to force compliance, but instead accelerated Canadian diversification, irreversible due to long-term contracts and built infrastructure. Midwest U.S. refineries still need Canadian heavy crude but face costly re-engineering or loss of supply. Dependency now flows both ways, with Canada controlling the export switch. Trade data from 2025 confirms the failure of tariff assumptions. Canada's exports to the U.S. fell 5.8%, the largest bilateral drop in decades. The U.S. share of Canadian exports dropped from 75.9% to 71.7%, the lowest since before NAFTA. Conversely, Canada's exports to non-U.S. markets rose 17.2%, a record increase. Trade with non-U.S. partners increased $69 billion, 14.3%, despite tariffs and oil shocks. Since new trade deals, the Canada-EU CEDA, CPTPP, China Strategic Partnership, UK Economic Working Group, Norway Agreement, and enhanced EU digital and labor provisions, Canada's trade with Europe and Indo-Pacific markets surged. Canada exceeded its 2025 export diversification target of $292 billion by reaching $296 billion amid global turbulence and the trade war. Instead of forcing Canada to negotiate with the U.S., tariffs pushed Canada toward global partnerships with binding contracts and resilient infrastructure beyond any single U.S. administration. The cost? Not paid by Canada, but by American importers passing tariff costs to businesses and consumers. The Supreme Court struck down EPA tariffs collecting $166 billion in duties, with refund liabilities up to $175 billion. American households paid roughly $700 more per year during peak tariffs, money taken from U.S. consumers under now deemed illegal authority. Refunds from tariff lawsuits will go to importers, not consumers who paid higher prices at stores, dealerships, and gas pumps. Steel and aluminum tariffs, raising U.S. vehicle costs by about $3,000, remain despite court rulings. These tariffs still affect cars, homes, appliances, and infrastructure made with Canadian materials. Canada's GDP fell 1.52% due to the tariffs, but the U.S. economy suffered too, through supply chain disruptions, investment delays, retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agriculture, and a 40% drop in Canadian tourism to the U.S., affecting hundreds of thousands of American jobs. The trade war destroyed wealth on both sides and failed to deliver any strategic wins for the U.S. Trump set 5 goals with these tariffs. Here's how they fared. Stop fentanyl trafficking. No success. Most fentanyl enters via the southern U.S. border and mail, not Canada. Reduce U.S. trade deficit with Canada. The deficit shrank by 25% in 2025, but because trade collapsed, not because U.S. exports increased. Remaining deficit driven by energy imports the U.S. can't replace. Bring manufacturing jobs back. Instead, 900 U.S. auto jobs were lost. Canadian auto parts sales dropped 70% and no reshoring happened. Rebuilding integrated supply chains requires massive investment. Tariffs didn't prompt that. Force Canada to negotiate on U.S. terms. Canada lifted some retaliatory tariffs as goodwill, but kept others, strengthening its negotiating position with legal rulings, alternative trade partners, and international alliances. Demonstrate American economic strength. This backfired. The Supreme Court struck down tariff authority, Congress voted to repeal tariffs, and U.S. global economic standing weakened while Canada built new coalitions. All 5 objectives failed. Workers in both U.S. and Canada bore the cost. On the Canadian side, Finance Minister Carney inherited a hostile trade environment, an economy reliant on the U.S. He launched a broad diversification strategy, including historic $81.8 billion defense reinvestment and Arctic infrastructure, new defense partnerships with Denmark, Norway, UK, and NATO Arctic engagement. Increased non-U.S. exports to a 40-year high, including expanded trade with China, EU, UK, and Indo-Pacific partners. Fast-tracked LNG export terminals and Pacific pipeline projects. Active diplomacy with global allies and trade legal challenges. Carney's pragmatic, data-driven approach outperformed Trump's instinct-based tariff strategy. According to White House insiders, a confidential 2026 review found tariffs failed to reshore jobs or rebalance trade, hurt U.S. agriculture, worsened energy dependency risks, and that Canada's diversification surpassed expectations. The U.S. is now worse off in every key metric, a truth unlikely to be publicly acknowledged. This private acknowledgement of failure will never be publicly shared, but reportedly reflects the administration's rare institutional regret. The largest bilateral U.S. trade action in history failed by its own standards. Looking ahead, the Kuzma review begins in July, with Section 122 tariffs expiring then as well. The ongoing Iran war keeps oil prices high, while Canada's diversification efforts continue unaffected by U.S. politics. Mark Carney will enter negotiations backed by strong legal, diplomatic, and trade coalitions, having exceeded diversification targets and proven Canada's reduced dependence on the U.S. Trump walks in burdened by a failed strategy, struck down tariff authority, costly war spending requests, weakened alliances, and diminishing influence. After 1 year of tariffs and conflict along a historically integrated border, the question is it too late for a reset? Can the damage be reversed at the negotiating table? Or has the trade war permanently altered the U.S.-Canada economic relationship, no matter who leads the U.S.? If Canada's export diversification, LNG infrastructure, trade deals, and alliances remain in place, then July won't be a negotiation, but a reckoning. Canada's share of exports to the U.S. dropped from 75.9% to 71.7% in 1 year and will likely fall further. Each lost percentage point represents supply chains and relationships that won't return simply by ending tariffs. The scorecard is clear. The trade war failed and the consequences are lasting.